back, Kyle. Here we
All
are.
right, welcome to the wrap. Here we are. Here we are. I don't think we're going to talk about AI this week. We're going to set that down for a week. I mean, you and I are going to talk about it a lot, but we're not
Yeah.
going to talk about it in the context of this conversation. So, what we are going to talk about is we're going to bring it back because this is a conversation we're having with a ton of clients right now, and it's basically, you know, the sprawl of telecom infrastructure. Like, this is still very much a problem.
Yeah.
Um, we're seeing it in a ton of conversations right now, even on the front end with prospective clients. Obviously, a lot of our work in our existing clients has been around this, and it's something that is still out there. So maybe kind of frame up the problem statement a little bit for us, and we'll get into it.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I'll try not to make it about AI, but I think that sometimes, fill in the blank AI, new technology, sometimes that makes it either more exacerbated or harder of a problem because, attentions,
Hmm.
priorities and those things start to shift. And then, resources aren't focused on controlling or optimizing some of those other more legacy technologies, or things of that nature. And so, all of a sudden, it's the old adage of like, if it's not broke, don't fix it, and it's not a fire until it's everything's on fire. But then you end up with the house on fire, and it's like, well, we should probably have taken some prevent, some. It would have been more optimal to take some preventative measures before you get to that place, right? And so, you may end up with, whether it's circuits or just telephony and infrastructure across different locations, that different, potentially different providers, potentially different setups, potentially different things that aren't actually optimized to what the business needs. They were bought at one point based off of what the business needed then, but fast forward however many years, and now you're a different place, and your needs have changed, and nobody's really gone back and said, hey, is this actually still fitting what we need? Um, or in some of these technologies, and we can get into some of it. Um, we went from on-prem systems into cloud systems, and we thought, well, okay, well, now I don't need that, that whole on-prem
Hmm.
team, um, because now I've got this fancy thing called cloud, and and over time, we kind of got rid of all those folks, and then it turned out, well, and now we've just moved it into the cloud, but we still need, people or teams to, um, you know, operationalize, control costs, you know, uh, essentially cultivate it over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they need to admin it, they need to contextualize it, they need to, make it powerful for your business. Sure, it is in the cloud and it just works. Like it just works, right? Like
Yep.
specifically, we're talking about unified communications, right? Like it will work. The endpoints will receive calls as long as everything's kind of configured correctly, right? You'll be able to make, receive calls, do the things you need to. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily making it powerful for your business. It doesn't mean that you're returning back the reporting that managers need. It doesn't mean that you're not leaving stranded services out there and paying too much because, as people offboard your company, you don't have your processes tight and ensure that, hey, like I'm either reassigning that license or recovering that license or doing anything like that. So, um, I think that that's really important on the legacy kind of telco network infrastructure side. It's back to, I mean, it's circuits, right? It's broadband, it's DIA, it's the physical pieces around voice, whether it's PRI or SIP or even POTS lines. Like we are still seeing a lot of that out there, and it's almost as if, I don't know, like what you were talking about. Like you've got things that are tensioning or stressing the system, that are then showing some cracks in the foundation. But the cracks aren't necessarily around like, hey, is my last mile network working? Like that's not necessarily the issue. What's the issue is it's the kind of administrative and the management overhead and burden around these things when you know you really want your smartest people in your company who understand the most about your company to be working on these strategic projects, not kind of keeping the lights on. And so we're seeing a lot of having a lot of those conversations, which is interesting. It's kind of one of these what's old becomes new again, sort of thing. I mean, this is the work that Resourcive was doing in, you know, the early 2000s,
Yeah.
for big multi-location retail who had fundamentally the same problem, right? A lack of visibility around everything that's out there, a lack of clarity around, you know, what specifically they were spending their money on, and if they had stranded services out there, and if there were more effective ways to do it and manage it and do it cheaper, and like all of that all of those are still very much conversations that we're in with clients, around their network, around their POTS lines, around that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I think some of that may happen ironically more in today's world than even previously, right? Like when you think about some of that, on-prem or physical infrastructure, like how often was there this real big technology breakthrough that would disrupt and change that? Um, but even if we talk about the UCaaS piece, not only is your business not stagnant, but the applications that the businesses that you're leveraging as a vendor, they're not stagnant either.
Yeah.
And so this
Yeah.
idea of a set it and forget it. I caught myself in this, right, where we have a system, and we was like, all right, we set it up, everything's good, everything's working, nothing broke. But then going back into it, it's like, oh wow, like they are making changes and updates and adding things that we could be leveraging as a business. And so without having eyes on glass or some type of way in which you're keeping in touch with that thing to continue to cultivate it over time. It's both things, right? Like you're not staying still, they're not staying still, and if neither one is trying to reconnect, you actually end up in a pretty big delta between what you're paying for and the potential opportunity that you have with those vendors or services.
Yeah, kind of left to its own devices, your value from what you pay dwindles over time,
Yeah,
because the impact of the tools that subscribe to, they're in a competitive market, right? Like assuming you've gotten with a vendor that is decent, right? Is
yeah,
kind of a leader in their market. They're in a competitive market. They are actively pushing out features, benefits, updates, etc., that are things that you may be able to utilize to drive your business forward and pay, maybe incrementally more, maybe no more,
yeah.
right? And it just depends, but it doesn't like that doesn't get adopted in your business on its own. You have to have someone who's looking at it and saying like, they're fundamentally a champion of that business, of that application and how it's being utilized back into the business. And so it's really, been an interesting change over time, specifically in that UCaaS space where, early on, I think companies were looking at it. And even part of the business case was around, hey, we've got this big on-prem Avaya system. We've got all these Avaya engineers, like, or maybe it's an outsourced third party, that's doing maintenance on it and doing all that sort of stuff. And there was kind of this concept of like, oh, well, we're not necessarily going to need that. And that's true. You don't need those engineers who are physically putting their hands on, the servers, the PBX, et cetera. But what you do still need is someone that is a champion for that tool in the business, and also admins that tool for the business, which is kind of a rebound a bit, that we're seeing more and more of.
Well, I'll steal something from a very wise man. This thing called a T intersection, um, where I think what you need in those instances is somebody who has an understanding of what the business needs, right? Like what are we actually trying to accomplish with these systems? What are the challenges that the business has? And then understands the technology enough to kind of bridge or glue those things together. Go, oh, well, this system that we have actually solves that problem, or we make these couple of changes, or these, whatever, can now address some of those problems. I think that actually has the potential to solve multiple issues. Like not only are you further adopting the solutions or vendors that you're already paying for, so you're driving additional value out of the spend that you already have. But that's one way to combat shadow IT, in that, because if you're not doing it right, like if you're not doing it as a business and figuring out how are you solving the challenges through technology, people in your business are. You just don't know about it, right? So there are, it's multifaceted as far as like the value that you're actually getting by taking that on as a discipline, getting the most out of your return, fighting some of that shadow IT, driving further and further adoption into these tools with your users.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've seen some of that internally here recently, right? Even on AI note taking tools, right? And I mean, it's something where if you're not proactively championing the systems that we have, then people aren't aware of it, but they have the use case, they have the need, right? And so they go out and find it. And so, it's something that you really got to stay on top of. On kind of the legacy infrastructure side, where we're seeing most of those conversations. I mean, primarily it's, often it's a VP of IT that we're talking to, or a VP of infrastructure, director of infrastructure, like that sort of role, and in multi-location. This becomes an issue when you have more than 20 locations. Under 20, a lot of times these kind of teams can manage it, right? You get over that 20 mark, starts getting a little complex, especially if they're kind of the site inventory is non-stagnant, right? You got something that's happening that's moving this. Maybe you've got, pop-up type sites as part of your business. Maybe you've got things that are moving, some things that are shutting down. Like there just ends up being a lot of moving pieces around this. Um, and it's that space where you probably don't have a traditional telecom manager.
Yep.
We see that at companies. You get 300 locations. You got a telecom manager most likely, or an outsourced type of partner that is performing that function, which we do for some very large clients. But um, that kind of call it 20 to 100 locations. Man, the need is there, the complexity is there, the team is just so lean though, and
Yep.
it just oftentimes that's also kind of a space where companies are really focused on growth, and so they're not necessarily laser focused on managing that inventory really tightly. Ton of opportunity in those accounts.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and a way to, um, way to offload some of that from your team too, right? And even how you would approach that from a strategy, because you're right. Like when people are in a growth mode or in a build mode, um, you know, walk into a shop when something's being built and it's a little bit more chaotic, right? Like there's things flying everywhere, there's stuff it's a little bit more chaotic environment because you're trying to move fast, you're trying to get things done. So you may have a bunch of things kind of sitting around, and then at some point you go back and you kind of clean up behind you. But there's an opportunity to say, hey, through partnerships, through different strategies, you can do a little bit of both without bogging your team down. Let them focus on the higher priorities, the things that are enabling growth and enabling speed, without necessarily having this giant pile behind you that eventually becomes something you're dragging with you like an anchor,
Yeah.
that slows down that growth.
Yeah, and the devil's in the details on this too, right? I mean, I'm just thinking, you think about kind of all of the, terrestrial type of circuits, just broadly circuits, literally wires of some sort that could be running into the building. And, what is happening in the market on those, right? You think about pots, and it's like, okay, pots, you got a physical copper line that's going in there. Man, that market's really interesting. You've got multiple providers that are actually trying to leave the market, right? And so they're raising prices on clients who are sometimes, surprised by the bill that they're getting, the fact that they still have these things, don't know what they're used for. They could be for fax, they could be for alarms, they could be for elevators, they could be for voice. Who knows what they're for, right? And so that's just one of the lines. You've got PRIs that could be out there who knows when they were sized, who knows if you're still even using them. They could be stranded. And that's another one where providers are trying to kind of leave the market, and so they're raising rates on it. Um, then you've got broadband, which is almost on the other side of this thing, right? It's kind of a lower level, just internet access sort of line, highly commoditized. If you haven't, looked at the pricing that's available there, you may be paying too much. You also maybe a lot of times, like office managers will go get that sort of thing. They'll get it on an entry level sort of bargain type of price. not understand that that's going to be reset 12 months from now. They're not looking at the contract term, right? And then you've got DIA, which is a totally different sort of animal, probably the most stable of any of these, but has been an area where there's been some cost compression as well. Like all there's just different market dynamics around every single one of these types of lines. And if you don't know what's out there, it's really, really hard to kind of manage that and ensure that you're doing what's most optimal for the business. Oh, but it all starts with having a very, very clear inventory about what's out there, right? So the type of circuit, the cost you're paying, the contract term around it, who the vendor is, contact information for them, right? Like that is, you know, while it's simple, it is rare that companies, of the size that we're talking about here actually have a complete inventory of that. But you have to have that to be effective in this space.
Yeah, yeah, and it can be, and it's a little tedious, right? Which is why I think companies don't always do it because, to your point, the devil's in the details. That POTS line could be going nowhere, or it could be going to a fax line, and you're a healthcare company that a significant portion of your revenue is dependent upon receiving faxes. And not cutting or not cutting one can have a very big impact. And so there's sometimes people, it's like, oh, well, we can't really figure that out, and so it's a future problem. But then that kind of compounds the mess, because over time, additional lines get added, additional ones kind of come in, and now you kind of multiplied the complexity and the mess, in which somebody's got to go detangle to figure out and make, optimize those solutions. Right.
Yeah. And this whole, by the way, this whole conversation gets continued at the physical edge, right? Where you actually turn this stuff over around the routers and the firewalls, et cetera. Just this week there was what we think is probably like a 0-day exploit on Sonic walls, right? And the configuration around them. And been plenty of instances where we go in to an inventory, especially in kind of roll-ups or M&A, and there are 6-7 different models of firewalls that are deployed out there, right? And it's like, well, if you don't have a really clear inventory on that, how do you respond when all of a sudden, you got a partner like us who's saying, hey, there's this 0-day exploit that is happening, today on this type of firewall. It's like, well, if you don't actually have that, like how are you going to do anything with it? How are you going to respond? Really, really hard to do so. So, again, all starts with actually having really, really clear inventory. And, that's something that we work closely, with our clients to go out and do. But having said all that, look, I mean, this is a conversation we're having a ton of with existing clients, with new prospective clients, and something that I continue to be surprised when it comes back around. I don't know why I continue to be surprised. It's like, but I mean, it's a conversation that we've been in some way, shape, or form ever since I started at Resourcive. The very first projects I was on were in big, large, multi-location retail, having this exact discussion. And so, it's just as relevant today as it was then, just as much of a problem, in slightly different ways, right? In slightly different ways. And the solutions are different, but, it's something that it's still out there. And, it is something that when we start talking to directors of infrastructure specifically about it, right? Like that sort of role, you start talking about it. No, yep. Yeah, I had one say to me the other day, he said, "Are you reading my mail?" Said, no. I just read a lot of your buddies' mail. Been in this with them.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we're still tied to physical locations with physical circuits and physical hardware at the edge, this will, in one way or another, and to your point, as stuff adapts, that complexity changes specifically, but it'll always be there to some degree, because you're dealing with real things in the real world across a geodiverse area with physical stuff, and so that's just going to naturally bring in some complexity that, as we've moved into cloud or moved into SaaS applications and those types of things, solve for in the digital world, because you can stamp out that architecture in a unified way. it's much more difficult to do that over time in the physical world.
Yep, absolutely. Excellent. Well, this is an area we're super impactful on for our clients. I would be remiss if I didn't just, make a call there. If this is something that you're dealing with, we should have conversations around it. And otherwise, that's a wrap.